Thanks for coming, everyone, to the webinar. My name is Alex Vetter, and I'm the marketing manager here at EasyMorph. We're thrilled to have you joining us for today's session, Connect, Automate, and Scale with APIs, where we'll show you how you can connect EasyMorph to other systems using APIs, whether you're receiving or sending data and automating data workflows. If you have any questions, please send them in chat. At the end of the presentation, we'll open it up to a Q&A for everyone. So let's go ahead and start with today's agenda. Today, we'll briefly go over a quick overview of what we're talking about. That includes an introduction of what is an API, why it matters, and how EasyMorph is not just an ETL, but a full data automation suite with hundreds of features. For the next section, we'll have one of our experts talking about how EasyMorph works as an API client, and we'll go over the basics of an API, how you can pull the data from other systems, and how you can iterate web requests. The next section, we'll talk about how EasyMorph works as an API server, showing you how EasyMorph can be called by other systems using custom API endpoints, which is an extremely powerful tool I'd recommend everyone to take a look at. And at the end, we'll go over our Q&A questions, so feel free to drop them in chat throughout the webinar. So today we have two experts joining us. We have Matt Fryer and Dmitry Gudkov. Matt is our technology evangelist. He does a lot of great work helping our customers solve real data problems, and he's also featured in most of the videos that EasyMorph promotes and creates. A lot of great content coming out recently, so good job, Matt. And we have Dmitry, who's our founder at EasyMorph. Combined, they have over 50 years of experience helping teams with data automation and improving workflows across various business units. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Dmitry.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks everyone for joining. And let's talk about APIs today. So I'm going to share my screen. So talking about APIs, we structured this webinar in a way that we start from simple things, very basic stuff about APIs. What is an API? What are the main terms used in this area? And then we will gradually make it more and more complex, touching more advanced subjects, how to access APIs, how to work with APIs as an API client, and we will tell a bit more what it means to operate as an API client. And then we'll talk about how to design or deploy your own API server, and we'll talk about that as well. And finally, at the end, we will say a few words about webhooks, using webhooks with public APIs. So the complexity of what we are talking about will gradually increase towards the end of the webinar. So the reason we structured it this way, because we want people with different background to learn more about how to work with APIs. So we hope that you will be able to learn something from this webinar, no matter what's your previous experience with the API automation and technical skills in general. So let's start with a few definitions. So what is an API? And an API, as an analogy, you can think of it's like an email where you have two people sending emails to each other. So APIs are something like that, but for computer applications, computer programs. The difference is that when sending emails, it can be one-way communication. You just send an email and that's it. So you don't expect anything back. But with APIs, the party that sends a message always expects something back. So it's a two-way communication, and also it's asynchronous, meaning that if one party sent a request, a message, then it expects that the other party will respond immediately or almost immediately. It's usually most requests are responded in sub-second time. So it's not like you send something and then 1 week later you expect a response. So API is usually fast, synchronous, and two-way. It's a two-way communication. Also, we will frequently use the term web API. And that can be confusing because you might think that, well, it's something related only to the internet or to cloud technologies. But that only means web in that sense means that it's using the so-called HTTP protocol, and I will talk about this in a moment. And this protocol, indeed, it was initially used for web servers and the web in general, but it turned out to be efficient, easy to understand, easy to use, and this protocol and this technology since then has been widely used for internal communications between systems on premises, meaning in your organization. So it's not in the public internet, but just, well, two computers sitting in your office may communicate with each other using a web API while not being exposed to the web. Now let's talk about the HTTP protocol, which is the basis of the API communication. So what is that? The HTTP stands for hypertext transport protocol. Sometimes it sounds very techy, but effectively, it's this protocol is quite simple. Its concept is very simple. Basically, two computers exchange text messages. It's very much like you send a text message or SMS, as people say in Europe, text messages to each other, except that these text messages have a certain structure. In this screenshot, you can see the structure of a request and the structure of a response, and they are pretty similar. So the first line in this text message is always a definition line or a start line that explains the protocol, the type of, if you look at the request, it requires the URL, the type of request, and the HTTP protocol version. It's almost always 1.1 in most cases. Then the next set of lines that follow immediately after this, so starting from the second line, we have a block of so-called headers. So what's a header? A header, that's basically metadata that consists of two parts, a header name and header value. For instance, here in this example, you can see that the header name is host and the header value is developer.mozilla.org. So these headers, they contain helpful metadata or information about the request itself. When it was made, who sent it, what was the authentication method used, what was the content type, and similar things. And finally, after an empty line, so an empty line is mandatory, it separates headers and the body. After an empty line, the last part is the body or the payload of a request. It's optional. It can be missing entirely in requests, actually in the responses as well. But most frequently it contains either something like a web form data or a JSON object or XML object. So that strongly depends on what type of communication is done. And the response is, the structure of response is pretty much the same. The first line is the definition, where you can see the protocol version and some other things. Then you have a similar set of headers, but these are response headers with some metadata about the response. And finally, the response itself. And it can be an HTML page or again, a JSON object or XML data or something else. So that's the HTTP protocol in a nutshell. As you can see, it's almost human readable. It's not too complex. And those web APIs are everywhere. Nowadays, basically the world runs on APIs. So thousands, hundreds of thousands of systems that communicate with each other through APIs every day. And it's a lot of valuable information and opportunities. So what can you expect when you start working with APIs? First of all, you can receive data from systems that operate your business processes, because sometimes it's not possible to obtain data from an application, especially if it's a cloud application. Obtain it through a database request, a database query, or through a file. So the only way how to retrieve data from a system is to use an API. Second, for automation, APIs can be used to trigger a certain action, such as performing operation, updating a customer record, or uploading or importing data into that system, or let's say dispatching an order for delivery, or something else, or blocking a transaction. All that can frequently be done through APIs. So using APIs is very good for automating things in general. And as we know, automation makes life easier. Finally, speed. Since APIs are almost instant and synchronous, it's good to use APIs when you need on demand. So for instance, when you need additional data to make a decision at the front desk or in the front office somewhere. So using APIs can be good for to ensure better customer service or to ensure better decision making. Why APIs can be hard? So while the HTTP protocol itself in its concept is quite simple, nevertheless, designing and working with APIs traditionally used to be a non-trivial task. First of all, traditionally, again, as you will see later, it doesn't have to be so, but traditionally, API automation requires a lot of coding. So you would use programming languages like Python or Java or C# to write programs that would send requests, process responses, encode data, and do many other things. And that's basically full-scale software development process with software developers, testers, business analysts, project managers, documentation, version control, quality assurance. So, and as you can imagine, that's all makes it long, expensive, and difficult. But it doesn't have to be so. Second, it's the high variety of APIs. While the HTTP protocol itself is well documented, well standardized, there is no a good single standard for building APIs. So basically, every API is custom built, and as Matt will show it later today, it's extremely important to have access to API documentation to understand how exactly this or that particular API functions. And that's another reason why API automations can be hard, because, well, every time you deal with an API, you have to look at the documentation. Finally, there's too much ceremony with the traditional API integration process. It's not only because it's a software development process effectively, but also APIs, they automate business processes, and business requirements change all the time. So you need to make changes to those APIs, which means that you need to upgrade those APIs frequently in real time. So you have to keep versioning, because some your API clients may not understand the new version yet. So there's lots of hassle, lots of ceremony, and that's another reason why APIs can be hard. So why EasyMorph? Well, first of all, EasyMorph makes API automation much easier and much simpler, because you don't need to do coding or programming with EasyMorph, but you can automate APIs using the same visual workflows you use for data preparation, and that makes API automation 10 times faster. Well, that's a rough number, but you get an idea. Second, EasyMorph, we try to abstract away technical nuances of API automation. So EasyMorph takes care of many technical low-level details such as authentication tokens or cookie management or session management. So EasyMorph takes care of this, so you can focus on business logic, what exactly your APIs should do from a business perspective. And finally, when you use EasyMorph for API automation, you don't have to learn a new technology. It's the same technology, it's the same type of workflows that you use for data automation, data preparation, but now it's employed for APIs. So because in EasyMorph, it's a one unified platform for data engineering, so it's the same technology used for all capabilities of this platform. And at the end, I wanted to tell a few words about API terminology that we will be using throughout this webinar. So what's an API client? API client, it's, as I mentioned, the HTTP protocol. It's a communication of two software applications or two parties. So API client, it's an application that initiates communication, and it does it by sending a request to the API server. And the API server is the other side of this communication. It receives requests and sends back responses to the client. And the communication is asymmetrical in the sense that only clients initiate this communication, and the server side always only responds. The server never initiates communications with clients. So the server always responds. Well, technically speaking, there are more advanced options and protocols for API interaction, and technically speaking, that's not strictly true, and sometimes the server can also initiate, but in most cases you can disregard that. So in most cases, in your real life, it will be the client who initiates communication and the server who responds. Finally, then endpoints. What are endpoints? Well, basically, since a server can process different types of requests, for instance, give me a list of customers, or give me a list of orders, or update this user information with a phone number. So since the server can handle different types of requests, for convenience, these requests can be pointed or sent to different addresses or URLs. It's very much like URL in a browser. When you open a website, you enter a URL. So the server might have multiple URLs simply to process different types of requests. It's not strictly mandatory, but it's made for convenience because an API server can respond to hundreds and sometimes thousands of different request types. So it's convenient to have different endpoints to serve them. And finally, OData. It's a protocol, or it's a standard for communicating with APIs. It removes many technicalities and it allows receiving data in a tabular form. OData it's a pretty good standard. Unfortunately, it's less popular than it should be, but still quite a lot of especially enterprise applications support OData. And if the system you need to connect to supports OData, then your life is immediately much easier, because OData abstracts away many technicalities, and you can simply connect and pull data using just one action in EasyMorph. So it becomes very simple. Now I'm passing the mic to Matt, who will talk about using API as using EasyMorph as an API client.
Thank you. So as Dimitri said, a conversation or an API conversation is always between two parties. Those parties are the client and the server. And we're going to start off looking at the client side of that conversation. That's where one party requests to the server for some information back and to receive a response. And the most common use case for that in EasyMorph, but also in general, so the most common use case for API calls is to request data. I make a request to an API server to give me back some data in some form. And in EasyMorph, then I can use that data in part of my workflow to do all of the things that we're familiar with in EasyMorph workflows to manipulate, transform, merge data, etc. In this scenario, EasyMorph is the client, and it's going to send one of those HTTP requests that Dimitri showed us earlier to a specific address. And hopefully, if we've fashioned that message, that request correctly, we'll get back a set of data. Thankfully, EasyMorph tries to abstract a lot of the technicality in that, and you don't have to write all of that HTTP request yourself. We just need to take EasyMorph as the client, work out how to get it and what are those parts to make a HTTP request to an endpoint on an API server, and we'll hopefully get a response, which is most commonly XML or JSON, but it could be any text, as Dimitri said. So fashioning that response, how do we structure that response, and exactly where do we send it is the most important part that we need to work out to interact with any API. The nice thing, as Dimitri said, is that all of this is founded on the same technology and infrastructure that you are all familiar with by just browsing the internet. You make a request to google.com and a web server passes you back a web page. And that is so familiar, and we're used to seeing web addresses. And thankfully, most of the sort of addressing and the information we need to put together to make a valid request to an API is very much the same. The first and the main part is that where are we going to send this request to? And this is sort of very familiar, as you can see some of the examples here. We have some requests which are just going to URLs with some additional information on the end. And those are mainly made up of 2 or 3 parts. We have the base URL, and that's the address of the server. So much like google.com, it could be a domain name such as mycrm.com in one of these examples. But it could also be just an IP address. And this is especially the case if you are talking to an API which is hosted internally within your business. It might not have a nice domain name for you to talk to. But that's the first piece of information we need. The next is the rest of the path that makes up that URL, and that typically is defining which of those API endpoints we want to talk to, which set of information that this API provides are we going to request to get back. And finally, optionally, we also have the ability to add what are called parameters or arguments to the end of a web URL. These you will see again in the address bar of your browser as you're just surfing the internet. But in the context of APIs, they're often used to provide some additional criteria or filtering. So as in the first example, we have a request for all of our orders, but we don't want all of the orders. We want only orders between a couple of dates. And there are multiple ways this sort of filtering can be applied. One is by applying URL parameters. And thinking about that whole HTTP request that Dimitri mentioned, we also need to consider if there are any HTTP headers we need to include to talk to a specific API, and if we need to send a body. Now, sending a body is less common in requesting data, but doing some of the more advanced things you might want to do with APIs, it will occur, and so it's worth knowing about and considering. So where do we find this information? Well, as Dimitri said, every API is basically unique, and so what data it provides, what format that data is in, how I request that data is almost entirely unique to that API. So we need to ultimately find the documentation for the API and try and explore that, because it is all about the documentation when it comes to working with APIs. Some documentation is amazing and really detailed and has lots of examples. Some not so great and is a bit more difficult to understand. But once you understand hopefully some of these building blocks and you can find that documentation, then you can start to understand it and pull out those parts. And those are the parts we still need to give EasyMorph to be able to be successful at sending a request for some data. So let's take a look at a typical set of API documentation. This is a freely available API on the internet that I've chosen to use. It provides data about various sports. I've chosen football, or soccer for those of you who call it so. And this documentation is ultimately what I need to read and understand to work out how to make a request to this API and how to get information back. But understanding some of those building blocks, we can start to initially see some of the things we're going to need to configure to talk to this API. The first is that base URL, the address of the server that's going to respond to us, hopefully, is listed at the beginning of this documentation, and so we can easily find that. We can also see that we are required to authenticate with this API, which is more often the case than not. And it tells us how we do that. So we need to use an API key, and we have to pass that key back as a specific header field, or one of a specific header field, in the request that we send. We also, if we scroll down this documentation, we'll find that it lists all of the endpoints that we're going to talk to get back a set of data. And so these are the endpoints and what information and data that making calls to this API can return to us. And so we'll come to look at one of these endpoints specifically in a minute, but let's first hop into EasyMorph. And let's start looking at how we can use this information that we're going to extract from this API documentation to actually request data in EasyMorph. I'm going to click on Add Data. I'm going to fetch data from the cloud application. And the first sort of thing I would say is that although I'm going to use the import from Web API action in this, as you can see, there are a list of other systems that EasyMorph natively supports out of the box. These are where they're either a bit more complex and difficult, but they're commonly used, or where we use them in-house as well. And our developers have done a lot more of the hard work for us in order to make a custom connector that talks to one of these systems API, and we just have to tell it our authentication information, and it takes all the hassle away. We can't do that for our API. That would be too easy. So let's select the web import from Web API action. And the first thing I need to do is create a connector. And that's connector gives EasyMorph the information about what's that base URL and how do we authenticate to it. So I will just call this my football API, and I can hear Alex sat in America hating me calling it football and not soccer. And I need to give it the base URL for that API. So again, we can see that our base URL is here, so we can copy that and we can paste that back into EasyMorph. And we then need to tell it how to authenticate. Now, as I said, our API is going to use an API key, but there are other forms of authentication. Not all APIs require authentication, but it is relatively rare. You want your business data and systems to be secure and only accept requests from valid people inside your organization. So most are heavily secured. And there are different forms of authentication, some requiring giving a username and password, some using single sign-on like you would inside many of your business systems in use every day. But a really common one is to provide an API key. So I'm going to provide an API key. It needs to go in the header. We saw that in our documentation. And we need to check the documentation. I will pick the bottom header field to add that information to. And then we have to give it our API key. Now, I have gone and requested an API key for this API. You will have to do the same. And again, how you do that will often be in the documentation and can be unique for each system that you want to talk to. And then it's always good to test our communication. I need to provide an endpoint, one of those sort of endpoints that can provide a set of data. And in this instance, I'm going to get a list of teams back, and hopefully we click test and it's successful. So with that connector setup, we can now reuse that over and over. And EasyMorph obviously can hold connectors on a server. And so individual users don't need to know how to authenticate with the API. They can just configure that once, or the system admin can, and then it can be used by other users if you want. So to formulate a message, as well as using that connector, we need to look at what endpoint we're going to talk to get that back. So let's go and look at one of those endpoints, and let's use that Teams one that we talked about and just tested with. So again, documentation varies wildly. This is very good. It details all of the possible parameters I can send to this endpoint that I definitely have to authenticate, what I can expect to get as responses, but it also gives me lots of examples. So I can see actual full URL examples and that can be sent to this, and that could be really helpful in building and picking apart that URL to find those individual parts that we talked about, and then configuring them within EasyMorph to make that request. So the first is the endpoint path, and we saw that was Teams. We can see it appears just as we saw in the example. And if we scroll down, we can see that it's possible to make a request for not just all teams, but teams within a country by passing one of those URL parameters at the end of the request. So let's do that as well. Back into EasyMorph, we want the Teams endpoint, and we'll add a URL parameter. We needed to put country, and being as I'm in England and the home of football, let's put England in as the country we want to request data back for. And if we've done everything correctly, we click apply. EasyMorph will package that up for me into a proper HTML request and fire that at the API server. And if we've done everything correctly, get a response back containing the data we asked for. And we have here a list of all of the football teams in England. So one point that may have been missed and isn't obvious at first sight is EasyMorph gave us a really nice table of data back, but that's not what the API sent. The API sent, as we can scroll down in the examples, JSON, which is messy and not fantastic for us to be able to read and use in tabular form, as we're all really used to. Thankfully, EasyMorph again tries to take over and take away the pain, and it will look at the response, the type of data in that response, and it will try and automatically convert that into a table of data for us, which we can then use and manipulate, transform, filter, and all those things we might want to do with a set of data, and we're used to doing with data in EasyMorph. So that is by far the most common thing you will want to do with an API from EasyMorph, requesting data, and from a REST or a web API, as they're known. Dimitri mentioned OData as well. We also have another action for requesting data specifically from APIs that support the OData standard. Again, I will add data, again from fetch from the cloud or the application, but this time I'll pick import from OData. This action is very similar in some ways, in that the first thing we need to do is configure a connector to point to that server and to authenticate with it. So again, I'll add a new connector. There are two types of OData connectors supported in EasyMorph, one specifically for Microsoft Graph OData. They have their own slight variation on the standard. And then there's the web location type, which is for all OData standard APIs. So I'll call this my OData API. Again, I need to provide a base URL, and rather than looking at lots of documentation again, I will just paste in the path to an example OData data source. And this data source doesn't require me to authenticate, so I won't go through that again. But all of those same authentication methods are also available to me if I want to. And hopefully we'll click test. Again, it's going to ask us for what set of data. I have to type it in here, but actually the connector makes it even easier for us once we want to use this, and we'll see that in a minute. I'll test it. I didn't get that quite right. I put product instead of products. Thankfully, we fixed it. We got that connector working, and we'll save it. Now, OData helps us in lots of ways, but the biggest way is that it makes all of the sets of data that we were looking at as endpoints available to us to browse, so we don't have to go and peel through all the information in a documentation to find all of the things that we might be able to return. OData calls them entities. They're exactly the same as kind of endpoints or sets of data. And as if I click the pick button, it will go and communicate with that OData data source and actually come back with a list of all the data sets that are available to me. I can see the products one again. I'll select that. And there are some extra options that OData provides with regards to filtering down that data to subsets, etc. But for now, I will just simply click apply, and hopefully we'll connect to that API. Again, EasyMorph has packaged that up as a valid request, sent it to that API for us, and we've got back a set of data, which again happened to be JSON. EasyMorph has realized, detected that, and turned that into a nice table of data for us, ready for us to do whatever we need to manipulate and merge and transform that data. So collectively, those two actions in EasyMorph, as we've just walked through, are really simple to use. They try and take away as much of the hassle for us as possible. And they, in doing so, are going to cover the vast majority of calls to APIs that you're going to want to make. You know, high 90% of all the interactions you'll want to do with APIs are going to be to get data, and those two actions will be able to help you do those. There are some other actions that I kind of refer to as the low level or the advanced actions in EasyMorph for interacting with APIs. These are needed when the API requires something a bit more advanced that these two sort of high level or simple API actions can cater for, or also as that scenario Dimitri mentioned, where I might not just want to get data from a system, but I might want to send data to a system as well. For example, I might extract data from my CRM system and send it to my finance system to keep my customer records constantly in sync. And whilst I could possibly get the data from the CRM system using these actions, I probably need to make a more advanced call to send that data to our finance system. The best way to look at these more advanced options is to take a look at one of the examples that ships with EasyMorph's desktop, the community users example, which, as it says, uses REST API calls to actually extract data from our EasyMorph community forum that I'm sure many of you will all be familiar with. If we open this example, we can see that it does quite a few steps, but the very first step is to use the web request action. And this is in many ways very similar to the import from web API action that we looked at a minute ago. Again, we need to provide a connector, and I could use the connectors we've already created. But this example uses a connection to the EasyMorph community API. But there are differences. I cannot just send a GET request, where these are types of HTTP requests. GET requests, not too surprisingly, generally get data, but there are other types as well. And again, in the API documentation, it might talk about using a POST request to send data to the API instead, or one of the other formats. And this action, whilst not taking away all of the headache, still does a lot for me and lets me be able to select what I want. I need a path as well. That's the endpoint that I want to get data from, but then not just adding parameters to the end of the URL. I can also tailor a body message, much like an email body, to send in that. Again, not very common if I want to get data from an API, but if I want to send data, I often have to put that information in the body in a certain format. And I can add other headers, etc., to this request. The other thing we'll notice is that the request doesn't automatically look at the data that's coming back and try and interpret it and turn it into a nice table for us. It's making it, sort of leaving it to us to be able to work out what we need to do to that data coming back, or that response, in order to use it, because we might not just want to turn some JSON into a nice table for us. The other very related, very similar action is also in this example, and that is the iterate web action. Again, very, very similar, all of the same types of configuration using those elements we saw that we can extract from the API documentation, but really used to make lots of multiple requests. So in this example, our first request gets a list of usernames for those people who have been active on the EasyMorph community in the last week or whatever time period. We then want to get back when was the last time each person was active on the community forum. And to do that, we can't make a request to one endpoint to get that. We need to make lots of requests, one after the other, to get that information for each person one at a time. And the iterate web request action lets us do that. We can iterate through that table of usernames, creating a specific HTTP request, sending that off to that server and getting a response back from us. And therefore, at the end, hopefully turning that into a nice table of data in the same way, but we've made lots of requests. And the other scenario where this iterating is very commonly needed is if I want a lot of data back. Many APIs put a restriction on the amount of data they'll pass back at a time. 100 or 1,000 rows or 10,000 rows. And so if I need more data, sometimes I have to make multiple requests to get that data in sort of pagination or pages at a time to get that data back. And the last two requests or actions in EasyMorph that are very commonly used that I'll mention is exactly this one. This is the parse JSON action. It's used to do exactly what EasyMorph's sort of simpler actions for APIs do automatically, and that is turn that JSON information back into a table of data. And there's also a parse XML action as well, which does exactly the same for XML data coming back as well. So hopefully that's given you a very quick walkthrough of the actions in EasyMorph that you can use and how you can start to explore those APIs that are available to you, the documentation, and how you can start to make requests to them to get data. I'll hand over back to Dimitri, who's going to talk us through the other side of that conversation then, as EasyMorph is acting as a server instead of a client. Over to you.
Share my screen again. So let's talk a bit how you can use EasyMorph to organize the other side of API automation by making EasyMorph an API server. So why would you might want to do this? Well, while APIs are nowadays not every system, especially if it's an external or in-house custom-made application or database, not every business application may have a ready-to-use API. So EasyMorph basically allows you to add an API to an application that doesn't have it. It can be a custom database, it can be a legacy application, or it can be some Python application or some command line utility. Well, and you can build APIs to even serve data from files and even spreadsheets because well, that's so easy with EasyMorph. Now let's look at an example how you can build an API to serve data from a database. So in EasyMorph, the API server functionality is hidden behind the API endpoints tab. This is a feature of EasyMorph server that may not be enabled by default. So if you don't have it on your EasyMorph server, make sure that it's enabled in the space settings. So once you have it enabled, this tab contains a list of API endpoints. And those endpoints are used to serve data using different workflows. In my case, I created an endpoint that is called organizations. I have a small database that provides data that has a list of organizations. 1 second. My internet is a bit slow today. Maybe I'll switch off my video to make it easier. Wait a second. A bit of technical problem. My VPN fell off. Okay, here we go. So yeah, so this is the endpoint settings, and here we specify URL path, which is the endpoint URL. This is the public URL that will be available for any application that needs to retrieve data from this endpoint or from our database. And this is the project, EasyMorph project or workflow that will execute once for every request and provide the data. So let's see how it works from an API client perspective or from an application that consumes data. I'm going to open a new browser window just to emulate the web client, but this can be a Postman application for testing APIs or anything else. Well, in this case, I will use the browser just to send a get request, and I will provide the URL, and I will use some ID for an organization. Now let's see what happens. All right, so EasyMorph returns a JSON object. If I make it more readable, so I asked the API to return details for organization number 1 to 3, and it did that. If I change the organization ID to something else, let's see. Okay, now it returns a different JSON object. So how does it work from a technical perspective? Here is the workflow that works that's triggered every time a request is received. This workflow has a parameter, organization ID, and this is the same parameter. This is the same parameter that we can see here. See, it's organization ID, and in our workflow, it's also called organization ID. If I use this parameter, then the workflow retrieves a company detail by using this organization ID. So it receives a record with company details. Then it produces a JSON object using the construct JSON action. And finally, there is the construct HTTP response action that constructs a special table with special columns that contains response information, which is the response code, response body, and the content type. My workflow has 2 branches. One branch for the case when a record was found for the requested ID, and another branch for the case when the branch isn't when the organization is not found. So in this case, we just return 404. That's by HTTP standard, by HTTP protocol. It's the response code when information is not found. So here I join two branches into one result table, and that the table specifies the output that is sent back to the requested to the API client. Another way how to use APIs is the webhook gateway. So the gateway, the gateway, it's a cloud-based service. It's optional, so you don't have to use it if you don't need to. EasyMorph is an on-premises application, but if you need to integrate with cloud applications and receive data from cloud applications in real time, trigger EasyMorph workflows in real time, then you can use EasyMorph Gateway. It allows integrating cloud applications with your EasyMorph server and build automations that span multiple systems on premises, cloud-based, you can build an automation that combines multiple applications into one workflow. To illustrate how the gateway works, I will use an example that collects data from a web form. So I've built a Google form, and Alex, can you please share the URL in the chat? Yes. So click this URL and submit your response. So meanwhile, your responses will be aggregated in this EasyMorph board. So, and while you are doing this, I will explain what's going on under the hood. So the web form you're using to submit your responses. So I will open it here as well. I'll open it here as well. Second. So this web form, your morning beverage preference, it has three options: tea, coffee, and champagne, if someone prefers it. So every time you make a submission in this form, it triggers a Zapier automation. So I used Zapier as an example. And Zapier has a native connector to EasyMorph gateway. So you simply have a two-form process automation here in Zapier. First, when it receives a Google Form submission, and second, it sends the response to EasyMorph server. And well, this response has one answer. It's a simple survey with only one question. So the response is simple, and it sends it to EasyMorph server through the gateway. On this server, I have a gateway endpoint configured to process the incoming requests. The incoming requests using, oh, my VPN is really glitchy today. Using a workflow. Okay, so here is the endpoint configuration. You can see that it has a public URL. This is the URL I used in here in Zapier automation. And this endpoint triggers a server task, and this is the workflow behind the server tasks. So it starts with a special action, incoming webhooks. This action retrieves incoming webhook messages, and the webhook, it's simply a HTTP request. It's a simplified HTTP request that doesn't expect a response. So it's a one-way HTTP request. So it extracts webhook submissions. So now we don't have any web unprocessed message in the queue. So I use test data to emulate a response. So this is the response. It's a JSON object. We parse it, and we obtain the human readable form, and then we increment a metric in our data catalog. And these metrics are then displayed on our board. So make submissions, and it will be updated. Okay, so we have a number of submissions. Zapier is not very fast, so the lag time is about 1 minute. So after you submit a new form, then your submission will appear here after about 30 to 60 seconds. Still not bad. Well, this is one example how a complex automation can work, and you can see that EasyMorph works as a glue that links multiple systems and applications together using the gateway and using a public API. That's all I wanted to tell for today on my side, and If you have questions for Matt or me, please go ahead and ask them in the chat.
So we got our first question from Andre. How and what is needed to deploy an EasyMorph API gateway?
All you need is send us a request that you need that you want to work with the gateway. So we will configure so-called tenant. So basically, we'll configure your account at the gateway, and we will send you back this tenant ID, and also we will need you to generate a private key because all communication between your EasyMorph server and the gateway is end-to-end encrypted using asymmetrical encryption. So we will need your public key. Your private key always remains with you. You don't share it with anyone, but we will need your public key to set up this encryption on our end. To remind you, if you have an EasyMorph server license, the Team Edition or Enterprise Edition, it already includes the basic plan, the starter plan for the gateway that allows, I believe, 1,000 requests per rolling 30 days, which is more than enough to start experimenting with the API. Another question: how to set an API that require a token? In the API server settings, here you can configure authentication. In my example, I didn't use an authentication, but you can configure, let's say, an API key. And in this case, you specify whether you expect this API key as a URL parameter or a request header. And in both cases, you specify additional parameter name or the header you expect. Let's say X my auth. That will be a header that your application will need to use to send an API key. And here in this list, you can specify multiple API keys.
We can't see your screen, Dmitry. Do you
know? Oh, my. Sorry. My apologies. Well, you should see it. You should see it by now.
Yep.
So I'll say it again in the server settings. In the API endpoint settings, there is this configure button where we can configure authentication. So here, then they use API keys, and for this setting, you specify whether we want to use a URL parameter or header. And here below, you can configure multiple keys. And by the way, you can identify your customers based on the keys they use. Right. Another question. So how do I? Sharing.
So we have another question from Jeff. Do you offer a one-on-one or a meeting to help configure EasyMorph to an API we have?
Yes, we do. Absolutely. Use the book a demo form on our website to talk in more detail how API automation can be configured for you using EasyMorph. Yes, Matt just shared the link. So of course, 1 hour is not enough to cover all the nuances and the aspects of API automation. So feel free to reach out to us, book a demo or book a call with us, just to talk about API integration in general, how you can do it, how it can work, what it may take. So any questions, any opportunities, anything that makes your life easier thanks to automation, we will be happy to discuss. Alex?
Right, everyone. I think that's it. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar, and you will receive an email shortly, probably within a day's time, about webinar recap, as well as a one-pager and the webinar recording. So be on the lookout for that email, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you so much, and talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.